All right. Welcome to the Assembly Committee on Education. Will the secretary please call the roll?
Assemblywoman Duran. Here. Assemblyman Flores.
Present.
Assemblywoman Gorlow.
Here.
Assemblywoman Hanson.
Here.
Assemblywoman Hardy.
Here.
Assemblywoman Krasner.
Here.
Assemblywoman Marzola.
Here.
Assemblyman MacArthur.
Here.
Assemblywoman Miller.
Here.
Assemblywoman Wen. Assemblywoman Tolles. Assemblywoman Torres.
Here.
Chair Bilbray Axelrod.
Here. And please mark Assemblywoman Tolles present, because she was here and bragged about it. And please mark Assemblywoman Wynn present when she arrives. I believe she will be here shortly. Okay, so welcome to everyone, to those in the room and those on the Zoom, and anybody watching on our YouTube channel. So this might be one of our last meetings, I'm expecting, so just bear with us. So I think you guys are used to our housekeeping things. For those of you who are on the Zoom, please mute your mic until you are on to minimize background noise. Please make sure your phones and laptops are on silent. And what else do I need to say? Let's see. Meetings for, or materials for this meeting can be found on the committee's webpage on Nellis. And finally, for those of you who are watching online in this virtual world, we do have several screens going at one time. So if you see members looking away, they are likely accessing meeting materials. So we have one bill to hear, and I'm going to skip the rest of the stuff and just say, Senator, please come up and begin when you're ready. Sorry.
Good afternoon, Chair and Committee. Thank you for having me once again. It's a pleasure to visit Assembly Education. For the record, I am Marilyn Dondero Loop, representing Senate District 8 in Clark County, and I'm pleased to be here today to present Senate Bill 353, which requires the Nevada Department of Education to review assessments, prescribe regulations to limit the time spent on assessments, and require districts to request a waiver to exceed those limits. Some of you may remember Senate Bill 303, sponsored by Senator Joyce Woodhouse in 2017. The bill required the NDE to audit the assessment tools and examinations used to monitor the performance of public schools and students in kindergarten and grades 1 through 12 to improve and streamline such resources. Ultimately, $92,053 was transferred from the State General Fund to NDE for the purpose of developing and carrying out that audit plan. During our robust discussion in the Senate Education Committee in 2019 on the audit results, many of us expressed that the audit did not result in actionable recommendations on ways to reduce the assessments. One reason for this was the frequency and number of assessments administered at the local level, which are not required at the state or federal level. The department responded at the time that to develop a balanced assessment system to help districts reduce formative and interim assessments would take time. Then over the course of that interim, members of the Legislative Committee on Education continued to investigate the amount of instructional time lost to assessments and talk about the impact that learning loss had on students. So the measure before you today, Senate Bill 353, attempts to address those concerns by requiring the Nevada Department of Education to develop regulations that have set up guardrails around the amount of time students will undergo testing. At this point, I would like to walk you through the bill itself, and then I have the Nevada Department of Ed with me today to answer some questions. Section 2 requires the NDE to review examinations and assessments administered pursuant to Chapter 390, Testing of Pupils in Graduation of the Nevada Revised Statutes for their educational benefit, cost, and redundancy in information, skills, or abilities measured. I would like to point out that 390 800 includes district-based testing. So Senate Bill 353 includes any district-based testing within the scope of testing that the Nevada Department of Ed is required to review, in addition to state or federally mandated examinations or assessments. Section 3 requires the Nevada Department of Education to adopt regulations prescribing limits on the actual instructional time taken to conduct the assessment and the total number of assessments administered in a school year. Section 3.5 provides general fund appropriations to the Nevada Department of Ed to fund these costs related to the contract services and the adoption of regulations to carry out the provisions of the bill. And with that, it concludes my part of the presentation. And this bill has been heard in Senate Education and Senate Finance. And so now we are here for your review. And I would like to call the Nevada Department of Ed up so that if you have any questions, you may address both of us. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Dr. Jonathan Moore, Deputy Superintendent for Student Achievement at the Department of Education. Ready to answer any questions.
Assemblywoman Torres.
Thank you, and I really appreciate this piece of legislation. Obviously, I've seen, just how many assessments we're doing in the classroom, and so I think it's great that we're going to take a look at that and make sure we're not taking too many days out of our instructional period of time because it's so important. I'm just wondering which assessments this is applicable to.
Jonathan Moore for the record, Assemblywoman Torres. So as the bill outlines, it's all the assessments that are pursuant to this particular chapter, which includes our summative assessments. What we do know is that outside of our required assessments, many educators administer assessments that are in tangent or in preparation for those summative assessments. So it'd be important to get that inventory as well in order to have an accurate determination or picture of how many minutes, the cost, and some of the other factors that are outlined in the bill.
Vice Chair?
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you to Senator Dondero Loop and Dr. Moore. You, as well as everyone who's listening in the state, has heard me along these lines for years now. And again, it did start with Senator Woodhouse's bill back in 17, and when that inventory came back, again, sadly, it really just addressed the test, whether you want to refer to them as standardized tests, summative tests, but just so that everyone understands the type. We're not talking about classroom and teacher chapter tests and unit tests. It only came back with those that the state required. And so we see the challenge, as Senator Dondero Loop mentioned, is that it's the additional tests. And I know I was in a meeting and with our superintendent of our school district when talking about there's a certain amount of tests required by the federal government, by the state, and then there was tests in addition to that required by the district, and then there were tests that were going on in schools in addition to that. And when I asked a question, and I had a school do an inventory for me, and they actually had 13 additional assessments and diagnostics that were occurring in addition to what the district was requiring, which was already extra of what the state and the feds were requiring. I will give you a mild compliment that the state doesn't actually require as many as everyone thinks. And so again, as my colleague mentioned, the time, the money, the stress. Again, this is one of these issues that the three of us all agree on. Parents, educators, and students all agree that, and again, it's not saying that we don't think there should be any type of testing. It's just the amount it should be. And while I advocate for no particular test, I do advocate for the reduction in testing. And let's streamline it and be consistent. So with that, my question is, is what kind of accountability measures are there? And again, for everyone that wasn't aware, this is coming out of interim ed, something that we reviewed extensively as well in interim committee. But what kind of time frame and what kind of accountability do you see being able to put in place from this? Because we know that, and also even by statute, the boards of trustees are supposed to be reviewing these things annually and have the ability to reduce them. So what kind of, once the department goes through the process, and here's what we need, and here's what suffice, what kind of parameters do you see putting around the districts in order to actually reduce it to what we actually need, and what's actually matching our standards?
Jonathan Moore for the record. Vice Chair Miller, thank you for the question. So once the exercise is concluded of the inventory and gathering the actual report for recommendations, I see two avenues. The first avenue is to come to the interim committee to present our findings. And I think as the legislation calls for, then there's the development of regulations, which in and of itself, that process is very public, creates an opportunity for stakeholder engagement, and also an opportunity for the State Board of Education to weigh in. In terms of what I hope will come from the process and what I believe will come, will be we get to a place where we're able to actually make recommendations and establish a balanced assessment system across the state. And so within that balanced assessment system, we have clear definitions of the different types of assessment, clear definition for regarding the data that each type of assessment yields and how that can be used, as well as limits for assessments regarding time, possibly recommendations regarding cost.
And with that as well, when it comes to time, because that's another challenge that we've discussed about, is that the companies say what time, the amount of time they believe that each test takes. And I know one in particular I always use because the company says it takes 60 minutes, and pretty much every educator and student tells you it takes about 4 to 5 times that amount. So will there be an opportunity for that kind of realistic data when the schools are saying, okay, but it doesn't take 1 hour or it doesn't take 3 hours, to go into that? Because I know time is kind of a, I don't know if time's the best way, but it's definitely something we should consider. And also with that, do you see the department limiting the amount or also having the ability to actually dismiss certain tests? Like if this test from this company is something that we don't support, that could be a possible regulation too. And also, I just want to take the liberty of saying, Chair, that everyone will agree with me that I did say something nice about the department, even though Superintendent Ebert wasn't in here to hear it. It was, I did say it on the record.
I will verify that.
Jonathan Moore for the record. Vice Chair Miller. So to your first question with regard to time, I do believe that there is room to work with whatever partner is selected to ensure that's incorporated in the methodology for the data collection to get an accurate assessment from educators regarding the amount of time they're actually expending. And that's actually a good data point of comparison versus what some of those tests may suggest by way of time. To your second question, I think part of what will come from the regulatory process, as I mentioned, stakeholder engagement, will be a list of recommendations for things such as time, things such as the number of assessment. I don't view my apologies. I will say that as it relates to assessments that districts or schools should be using, I do see a way in which the department would be able to set guidelines and set suggested and release suggested guidance for the implementation of certain assessments that schools and educators should follow in order to relieve the burden, but also ensure an accurate accounting of student learning.
And Marilyn Dondero Loop, for the record, just to add to that, as an educator and as someone who's been in many classrooms, I would also add to that I sometimes working with a vendor, if you will, a test provider, assessment provider, those are the decisions you make. You may love this evaluation over here, but if you know it takes a lot of time, you either have to work with that company to say we can't afford this kind of time, or you may choose another avenue based on the fact that it doesn't take as much time, but it will give you that same amount of information.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And when you were talking about the amount of time that it takes, it just made me think of it in my world how when you're working on something and with a private vendor, and then a lot of times you'll get like a little survey at the end to ask, how your experience was. And I'm just wondering if we could do something where we could get that information, and be able to construct it somehow.
Marilyn Dondero Loop from the record. I can only speak from the vendor world, if you will. I do know that when RFPs are put out and decisions are made on those kinds of things are always asked. I don't know that they need to be within the actual legislation, because those things are almost always asked. I don't care if you buy a biology book or purchase a test or have a professional development training for teachers. There's always some kind of a review at the end that says, how did you like this and why?
Yes, I wasn't suggesting that we legislated. I was just sort of thinking off the top of my head. I know we have a question from Assemblywoman Gorlow.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you so much for being here. And I will apologize if I'm totally missing it. My eyes are just going blurry this time of session. Doesn't matter if my glasses are on or off. But I'm seeing that, we're talking about at the beginning of the bill of what you'll be assessing and developing regulations, the cost of doing the assessment, and then the reversion to state general funds. But I'm not finding how long you have to complete the review and make the recommendations.
Jonathan Moore for the record, Assemblywoman Gorlow. And so based on section 3.5, the cost distribution, we anticipate that the inquiry would occur over the biennium. And so obviously sooner would be preferable, the earliest that we could receive that information, but it would occur over the biennium would be the plan.
Great, thank you very much.
Assemblywoman Nguyen.
Thank you, and I apologize if you answered this. I was trying to look it up. But you had talked about the assessments, including teacher assessments. And so are those the teacher created assessments? And I'm not really sure how, and maybe you could explain how NDE would accurately determine incorporate these assessments that teachers are doing, I guess, in their classroom based on their curriculum, and how that would be incorporated on this. Are the teachers submitting their assessments to NDE, or how does that work?
Jonathan Moore for the record, Assemblywoman Nguyen. So regarding the methodology for gathering that information, I believe part of it would have to entail an actual survey within each of our school districts regarding that specific information. And so part of the methodology would have to include regarding a specific district, which assessments are administered and for what purpose. I imagine part of the methodology may involve a survey of teachers, or if not, a sample of the teachers in a specific setting across multiple grade levels or content areas. And then I also believe part of the methodology would include not just assessing those teachers locally, but also central office staff who oversee locally prescribed assessments. And so that data would be yielded, if not through the entire population, but a sample.
I just had some concerns that it was not a situation where if you had let's say you had a school with 4 fifth grade teachers and they all had slightly different assessments in their classrooms, and then they had an assessment for their school and their team, and then there was one in the district, and we had 1,000 different assessments that we were using and requiring people to submit. I just wanted to make sure that wasn't the case.
So Marilyn Dondero Loop for the record, and I'll answer that from the teacher's point of view. Almost always when you're in a classroom setting, you have something you're following. Even if you are an English teacher that is using novels in a high school English class, you have some sort of guidelines that you're following. And I would tell you that in all the years that I taught, we always sort of did the same things in grade levels or departments that I worked within. So it would be highly unlikely that you would have 4 second grade teachers that all did 4 different sets of spelling words on Friday, right? Or you'd had social studies teachers in middle school who were not working together. So you're generally working on units, and you're oftentimes using a vendor supplied classroom textbook or some kind of information off of the internet where you're following we have standards and we have benchmarks that are developed by the State Department of Education. So it's not just this random, I'm doing this because I want to do it. It's all based on those standards, benchmarks, and then what the classroom teacher prepares together.
Assemblywoman Toles.
Thank you so much, Chair. And first, let me just say thank you, and yes and amen to bringing this forward, because I do know that this has been a conversation for so many years, and principals and teachers and parents and kids. And I echo the sentiment of the Vice Chair that this is something that has general agreement across the board. I think the only thing that I would just add to it is, and I don't think it has to be written into the statute, but I just want to make sure that I ask it on the record, is there also going to be in the formulation of these recommendations an analysis of other states and how, where they limit and what their recommendations or regulations are around the number of assessments that they typically utilize.
Marilyn Dondero Loop for the record. I'll give you the layman's answer and then I'll let Dr. Moore continue. But I would tell you that this State Department and their leadership has got an exorbitant amount of national work behind them. We are very, very lucky to have this leadership. And with that being said, I don't think anything that we do in education doesn't ever go by without us asking which state does it the best. So I would say that absolutely will happen. And then on top of that, I would say that we're always compared in every data book that anybody has ever created, known across the entire United States, world, and beyond. So there will be lots of comparisons along the way. And I think it bears repeating that some of these assessments are federal assessments that are required. And so those federal assessments that are required will stay in place. I mean, those are not things that we can just say, well, we're not going to do this, we're going to do this.
Okay. I had a question on Section 3, subsection 2, that talks about if a board of trustees or a governing body of a charter school requesting a waiver to exceed the limit. I'm just not familiar. I know we don't have anyone from the state board, but I don't know, Dr. Moore, if you can discuss what that looks like.
Jonathan Moore for the record, Madam Chair. So in my mind, based on what's written, that would be developed through the regulatory process. So through the regulatory process, the department worked with the state board to establish, one, what the waiver would look like, the information that would be necessary, what an approval process would look like. Some of the considerations that would need to transpire would be based upon the recommendations that stem from this inquiry. What are some of the guidance or parameters that we would expect LEAs to follow? And then that would inform any waiver that were then submitted if an LEA wanted to, let's say, exceed that guidance or go beyond what's recommended potentially.
And thank you for that. My concern is that some populations might get sucked up in that, whether it be ELL or additional service, things like that. And so which is a concern to me, and I just want to make that very clear on the. I guess I'm not really understanding what is in your mind, who are the folks that would request additional assessments?
Jonathan Moore for the record. Madam Chair, with regard to the requesting of additional assessments, I could see a context in which, let's say that a school district followed recommendations and they had built their assessment infrastructure. Potentially, they may want to pilot another assessment if they believe one assessment's not meeting their needs. They may want to pilot an additional assessment simultaneously in order to gauge if the one they have is great or if there is something better. That could be a world in which a waiver, would be requested.
So to be clear, it wouldn't be for a certain demographic of students. It would be like district-wide, possibly for like a pilot program or something like that. Is that correct?
Jonathan Moore, for the record, to the Madam Chair, that would be my estimation.
Okay, thank you. Assemblywoman Krasner.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick comment. I just wanted to say thank you, Senator Don Loop and Dr. Moore, for bringing this bill. When talking to constituents, the one thing I hear from teachers and parents is too much test taking, too much assessments. So thank you.
Reading. Okay, any other questions? Okay, with that, we will open up to testimony in support. Do we have anyone? I see Mr. Daly coming forward with a noticeably absent pen. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chris Daly, Nevada State Education Association. First, I have to break the news to you. The first 116 days of this legislative session was actually preparation for all legislators to take the S back. Starting tonight, going through Monday, will be a big pizza party. Monday night when we're through the testing. Seriously, NSCA supports SB 353 requiring the Department of Education to review student assessments. This has been a top concern of many classroom educators, shifting the focus away from learning towards a culture of high-stakes testing. We've been working for a number of years on this issue. I got to present SB 303 that you mentioned with then Senator Woodhouse to require the testing audit, and then also asking the department to make recommendations around streamlining. While the bill was passed with bipartisan support, we hate to say that the department did not move. This was under old leadership, did not move as expeditiously as we hoped. The audit was completed more than a year after its due date, which did hamstring that legislative session in terms of making and implementing recommendations. The audit did contain some interesting information about the time educators spend administering assessments. 84% of the state's district test directors at the time stated that too much time was spent on the Smarter Balanced Assessment, or the SBAC. Responses from those responsible for administration of assessments highlighted the continued need to streamline these assessments. And then in the focus groups and in surveys of classroom educators, the responses were even less kind to standardized testing. We do want to acknowledge that some changes have been made over the last several years, including, for example, the end-of course exams, but more needs to be done. SB 353 would require the department to look at the benefits, costs, and any inefficiencies in student assessments and adopt regulations to prescribe limits on the time and number of assessments. We think that this current department is taking this task more seriously this time, and we're hopeful that we can spend more time on teaching and learning and less time on testing moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daly. Not seeing anyone else in the room, and I know we don't have anyone on the Zoom. BPS, do we have callers in support?
Chair, there are no callers on the line in support at this time.
Thank you very much. And with that, we will close testimony in support and move to testimony in opposition. Obviously, we have no one in the room and on the Zoom. Is there anyone on the phone line in opposition?
Chair, there are still no callers to testify in opposition.
I see where this is headed. We will close the testimony in opposition and open testimony in neutral. We do not have anyone in the room, and we do not have anyone on the Zoom. And sounds like we don't have anyone on the phone line either. Is that correct?
That is correct, Chair.
Thank you. I will close the testimony in neutral. And would you like to come back up and say anything, Senator?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Committee. And I'd just like to close with I urge your support of Senate Bill 353, which seeks to maximize instructional time for our students and reduce the burden of excessive testing, and support our State Department of Education in ensuing this task. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice to see you. Okay, with that, we will go to our last item on our agenda, which is public comment. Is there anyone in the room who would like to speak for public comment? Not seeing anyone. BPS, is there anyone on the phone line?
Chair, the public line is open and working, but we have no callers at this time.
Thank you very much. So that leaves committee with what the lay of the land looks like. We will have meetings every day, but it will be called with the chair. We do have bills that we will probably be work sessioning, but I just don't know when. And we also could receive a bill as well. So we will be seeing each other, I believe, at least one more time for work session, possibly to hear a bill, depending. And I'm just going to say one more thing. Several of us are wearing gray. Because it is Wear Gray for Brain Tumor Awareness Day. So just wanted to give a shout out to all those inflicted and the family members, survivors of a terrible, terrible disease. So I will possibly see you tomorrow, possibly Saturday, possibly Sunday. Who knows? And that's it. This committee is adjourned.